So to understand language development, we're typically using something called computational cognitive modeling to encode a child's learning process very precisely. That's the kind of quantitative technique that we're using. And we think, as researchers, that the child's learning by basically counting different parts of her input and reasoning over those counts, typically unconsciously, but nonetheless reasoning over those counts in a sensible way. So the model is going to do the same thing. It's going to count the same things we think the child is counting and learn about language by doing principled reasoning over those counts. So let's think about this and let's sort of demonstrate a walkthrough of this for speech segmentation. Again, that idea of taking a fluent stream of speech, which, we might sort of represent just for our purposes here as a stream of letters. Of course, it's actually an acoustic signal of some kind. But we're trying to divide this up into things that we recognize as words, right? So what a pretty kitty, from the mishmash that it was before. And so in general, when we look at the kind of utterances that children hear when they're infants, when they're first starting to do this process of speech segmentation, these are the kinds of things they hear. What a pretty kitty, what a cute penguin, look at the pretty birdie, the kitty is very cute, do you see the kitty? Not very long, lots of repetitions, certain types of child register words that you might not say to another adult, right? But these are the kinds of utterances that infants hear. And before infants know where the words are, we might think of them as being perceived more like this, right? Just as a stream of speech, which here we're representing by squishing the words together, getting rid of the spaces, as it were. And the job of the infant, usually at this point maybe 6 months old, is to find where these words are, to segment the words. And one idea, based on what we know about infant speech perception, is that children initially perceive syllables quite reliably, right? They're able to break up that acoustic stream into things that look like syllable units. So maybe something more like this. Sometimes they might correspond to a word, sometimes they might break up. A word like pretty being broken up into 2 syllables, birdie being broken up into 2 syllables, but they sort of get a stream of syllables, and it's just a matter of deciding, which ones go together, right, and which ones stay apart. So one learning theory is that infants are counting syllables, how often certain syllables occur, and where they occur, right, in the fluent speech stream. So those are what's being counted, and then infants can reason about those counts to figure out where the words are in this case. For example, deciding perhaps that ki and ti belong together, and kitty is a word, right, that you're going to find in your utterances. So this is what our computational cognitive model can do, to count syllables and reason over those counts in a principled way. Now, an example of this, an example model, comes from my research group and uses Bayesian inference as the way to reason about counts of syllables in a child's input. And so this learning strategy basically involves the child trying to figure out what collection of words called a lexicon, a fancy name for a vocabulary list, could be used to actually to create the utterances that she hears, like what words are here, right? And that's what you're trying to uncover, is what's the list of words that made these utterances. And so, for example, here are some possible lexicons a child might consider for the very first utterance. What a pretty kitty, right? Divided up into syllables, so pr and t are split up, and kit and t are split up. And you can see some of these, possible lexicons squish some words together, split other words apart. So pretty and kitty sort of end with t, right? So you might split that off and keep pr and kit, right? Or you might keep pretty and kitty as their own individual words, but still squish together what a. Or maybe you sort of have what a, pretty and kitty. Or maybe you split up what and a, but also pretty and kitty. Or what a pre, and then you have t, and then ki and t. What a pretty, but you have kitty as its own word. What a pretty is one big old word, and kitty as its own, or what a pretty kitty is one big old word, right? These are just different possibilities, right, for the lexicons. And of course, again, this is the adult-like one, right? But these are other ones that are sort of compatible with this particular utterance. They can all create this utterance. So each possible lexicon, again, this is the point, could be used to generate the observed utterance. And so the kid's trying to figure out, well, which one should I pick, right? So again, just to show you here, more concretely, if we take this first lexicon, this is how you generate what a pretty kitty. You take what a, pre, t, and ki, and t. right? You're using just these pieces in this order. You can do it with this one, where whata is a single word, and then pretty is a single word, and kitty is a single word. That works too. You can do, say, this one, where what a pretty is a single word, and kitty is a single word. And right, all of these are going to generate this stream of syllables, right? So that's the idea. They're all compatible. And the child's trying to identify the most probable one. Okay, so the model child in the computational cognitive model is going to choose the most probable one using that reasoning process we talked about earlier, Bayesian inference. In this case, it's the probability of a particular lexicon under consideration given the set of utterances. Here we just have one, but remember there's a whole set of utterances a child's going to encounter, right? But that's what we're trying to find. It's the one with the highest probability, right? So we find the lexicon with the highest probability given, that's what that little symbol is right there, given the utterances that the child encounters, and of course these syllables in those utterances. And this is going to depend on two other probabilities. So the model reasons about this probability that it wants by considering these two. So the first one is the probability, the prior probability of the lexicon. This captures any preferences that the model child has that we think real children would have too, right? Just like, what kind of lexicons are you looking for? What are the properties of these lexicons? And so, for example, one preference might be to prefer lexicons that have fewer words. So in this collection right here, these actually only have 2 or even 1 word. Will definitely have fewer words. That might be a nice property for a lexicon to have. Another preference would be to prefer lexicons with shorter words, right? So here, these are pretty short, right, compared to that one, which is like super long. These are also super short, right? So as you can see, these are different lexicons than the previous preference would have you pick out. And so these preferences compete with each other, right? To have fewer words, rather, to have shorter words, right? So you have to find a balance between this. And so the model child is going to use Bayesian inference, to reason about the lexicon that's the best balance between these preferences, for example. Maybe this one is a good balance between fewer words and shorter words, right? And the other probability that has to be involved is the probability of the utterances given that lexicon. So whatever lexicon you think you're looking at has to be able to have a high probability of generating those utterances. You have to be able to recreate the utterances you're encountering. So these two pieces, the prior and the likelihood, are what's used to reason about what the best lexicon is. Now we can then see if the lexicon the model child identifies has the right kind of things in it, like, for example, what we as adults would recognize as real words, right? And if so, then the computational cognitive model has captured, using this particular math, counting these syllables in this way, reasoning using Bayesian inference, how a child could identify words, influence speech, what learning strategy, right, might work. And it turns out that this learning strategy for speech segmentation is actually quite useful. What do I mean by that? Meaning it can segment realistic English input to children fairly well. Although the inferred lexicons aren't perfect, for example, it might make a mistake by squishing together pretty and kitty into the same word, right? Because maybe that appears a lot, and so in fact, pretty kitty as a single word seems to be the best fit for these utterances, right? So it's not perfect, but it's pretty good, right? And it turns out, in particular, that these imperfect lexicons, like having pretty kitty as a single word, are actually very useful for subsequent stages of language acquisition, like learning, once you have these little words in your lexicon, what they refer to in the real world. Like pretty kitty maybe refers to this guy right here, right? So it's a useful strategy. And this was true for idealized modeled children who had perfect memory and perfect processing abilities. Well, children aren't perfect, right? They have limitations. So what about modeled children with more realistic constraints, constrained babies, on their memory and processing abilities, right? Can they still use this strategy to get pretty good lexicons? Is the segmentation strategy usable, right, by children who have these kind of cognitive limitations? And the answer is yes. Model children with cognitive constraints on memory and processing can still use this strategy to segment English pretty darn well, which is great. So then another question is, well, does it work for different languages besides English, right? Different languages out there. And the answer is yes, it actually segments very well for languages that have quite different properties when it comes to how they put their words together. So Spanish and Italian, German and Hungarian and Japanese and Farsi, the strategy works pretty darn well, right? So it's consistent. And so what we were able to do by using these quantitative techniques that were part of our computational cognitive modeling, we were able to discover how good this particular segmentation strategy is. It's useful, it's usable, it works across different languages. So we learned about language by using math.